So some of you who might have watched some movies about law school, etc., they always refer to this Socratic method, which obviously has nothing to do with Socrates. It's just a shorthand, but not a very smart name for asking questions. Obviously, not every asking of questions are Socratic method, especially when the teacher asks that, like when I teach in a Socratic method. Socrates never taught anything as you because he didn't claim to know anything. So the idea here is very interesting that we use the word almost opposite of what he meant. So Socratic method is like, I know the answer, and these are your annoying teachers that I'm also one of them, asking you questions, the answer to which they know, but they want you to say it, etc. So that's not Socrates. Socrates presumably genuinely asked the question, and it also asked the question like to the what they claim to be expert. For example, in Euthyphro, you already understood obviously that Euthyphro claims to know everything about piety and what piety means. So the reason that Socrates is questioning somebody is really to question their authority. So Socratic question is never like asking questions to someone who is less powerful than you are. And it is never sort of in order to belittle people, in order to expose them, in order to expose these law students in Harvard Law School, for example, and to sort of like embarrass them in public or something like that. It's quite the opposite. It's actually, there's an expression in Quakers like speaking truth to power. This is asking questions to power. So that's really his method. So that needs to be clarified to understand what Socrates is about. So he was, as you obviously started reading, was indicted. He doesn't say prosecution. I mean, at the beginning he says it's not a prosecution, but it's indictment. He is indicted for various charges, and he is on his way to the court that he meets Euthyphro. And this is the beginning of the extended scene that spreads across 3 or 4 dialogues in which we witness how Socrates is executed, or he drank the poison. So that's Plato's account of how this took place. Now, obviously, as far as the story goes, it seems to be pretty straightforward. What we are going to do is to concentrate on certain conceptual elements when he asks questions about piety, because obviously one thing that you must have noticed is that our ethical standards, our moral standards, even today, actually, especially today, come from, for a lot of people, from religious conviction. And here we have the sort of conceptual question as to whether it's at all possible to derive any moral principles from religious teachings. So this is obviously the starting point of philosophy. This is the conceptually the most important contention between philosophy and religion, namely, can we really derive our morality from gods in this case? And obviously there are specific difficulties as to whether you are a pagan or maybe later monotheistic, etc. But we are going to concentrate on those aspects. So we are not really going to stay with the story, only what happens, etc. But within that story, what kind of conceptual problems emerge. But as far as the story, it's pretty straightforward. They are on the way to the court, they chat a little bit, and then they go to their separate ways. That's really the plot. So that's really not the point. It is not an interesting story. Nothing happens. It wouldn't make a good movie or something like that. But what happens in the discussion is important. So am I clear so far? Any issues? Any problems? Okay, so it starts with Euthyphro and Socrates meeting near the King Archon's court. The Archon is the King Archon is the sort of magistrate for the in ancient Greece. Archon comes from the Greek word arche, the same root. Arche means ruler. It's used as public office, monarch, etc. But arche also means an important philosophical principle, The first principle, the origin. So whenever you have like anarchy, that's the same, no ruler, there is no ruler, anarchy. Or archaeology, that's the logic or the study of the arches, the first emergence. Or we use this hierarchy, that's the same word, hierarchy, sort of everybody, every ruler is somehow listed according to some standard. And then monarch is also another word. So these are all Greek words in our language that we use that comes from that word arche, which is also happens to be the rule. And also in this case, it's the rule of law, the law. So they meet at that king's court. And then Euthyphro asks, because he's surprised, obviously, he says like, you are not coming here because you are indicting somebody. And that's pretty clear that Socrates would never indict anybody. So why do you think that is, given what you know so far about Socrates? Go ahead. You don't need to raise your hand, just unmute yourself.
Well, I think in order for him to indict someone, he would have to like be an authority and like claim to know what is true about someone else, which does not seem like him at all to me.
Well, that is exactly true. So this is good because this you sort of immediately have like, oh, as a true philosopher, you are not really sort of know-it-all expert, but in fact, quite the opposite. You are really not judgmental in terms of understanding other people's positions and actions, etc. Now, this is pretty radical in Socrates. Of course, nobody is really like that. So that's why he's a little bit of a created figure in the sense that he doesn't judge anybody. He wouldn't take anybody to the court. But when somebody does something to you, you immediately know, right? Or you think you know that they are doing something wrong. I think this is sort of implanted in us very early in our childhood. I know from my daughters, because whatever I do, they say that's not fair. So I asked them, so what is fair? They don't like that very much because they want to stick with that notion of fairness and then use that judgment. So fairness somehow defined in terms of our relationship to it. So when Euthyphro says you would never indict anybody, that's an important point, that you would never really judge anybody. And that's really Socrates' point. So he doesn't even judge people who are in position of power. Now, we do that a lot, obviously, nowadays more than in the past. But he really judges not them as persons, but on what they do and what they say. And not what they say and do in terms of, oh, I don't like it, but try to understand its logic, its definition, its justification. So here we will immediately see that he is going to do the same thing to Euthyphro, not because he has anything against Euthyphro. Euthyphro might not even be an expert, etc. But he claims to know because in empathizing with Socrates, he claims, oh, people don't understand us. We know things. He obviously doesn't really know Socrates because Socrates doesn't claim to know anything, but he says, oh, we know things. This is the matters of piety. Now, this is on page, the first initial page, on page 3. So as you see that they are talking about Socrates, some charges are brought against him for not believing in the gods of Athens, which is an important, obviously, important point for Socrates. So, and also gods, like you are aware of the fact that this is polytheism. So this is gods, not even in the sense that we use the term God or the concept of God. There are multiple gods in ancient Greece. So not believing in God is like not believing in more than one God. And then that will be a particular question, of course, is that these gods, ancient Greek, if you read any ancient mythology, they don't always agree with each other. So that is going to be a particular problem. And here you see logically and conceptually why people are moving towards monotheism. And Socrates is really one of the most important contributors to that, because monotheism is logically consistent, because you really need one God. You can't have God fighting with each other. And if you have that, then you really don't get what you need from religion. You just get more questions. Why are they fighting? I need one correct, always true answer, and only one God can provide that. But that's the conceptually where we are going to move. So he says, you don't believe, you believe in false gods, and then you corrupt the youth. Let's leave the corrupt the youth for a second. But he says, what is the charges? For he says that I'm a maker of gods. And this is on page 3b. Actually, I can share this, but do I need to? Do you prefer that? Okay, just 1 second, bear with me. I'm gonna try to find this. Okay. Okay. You see this? Okay. So this is on page 5 in the other dialogue, but if you follow the marginal numbers, then you are going to be okay. So in the margin, there's a 3 here, and then 3b. Strange things. Well, he says, tell me, what does he say you do to corrupt the youth? And then he goes, strange things, to hear him tell it, for he says that I'm a maker of gods, and I am on the ground that I create new gods while believing in the old, while not believing in the old gods. He has indicted me for their sake, as he puts it. Okay, and then Euthyphro continues, I understand, Socrates, this is because you say that the divine sign keeps coming to you, and that there is a footnote there. Footnote here down on page 5. In Plato, Socrates always speaks of his divine sign or voice as intervening to prevent him from doing or saying something. He never but never positively. The popular view was that it enabled him to foretell the future, and Euthyphro here represent that view. So what is it that you would say as a divine sign coming to someone and saying not to do something? What does that sound like? Does that happen to you? It is, but do you have a Socratic moment, Socratic affiliation? What does it sound like? Yeah.
Well, what was the question? I'm sorry.
The question is, Socrates has this divine sign or a voice, inner voice, that tells him not to do certain things. And that's why he's accused of inventing new gods. Daimon, he calls it, a daimon, a little daimon I have, that's the Greek word, that tells me when I'm about to do something, don't do that. What does that sound like?
Your
Conscience?
Exactly. It's your conscience. You have it. I hope you have it. So you are about to do something, and then there's nobody looking, nobody is seeing, nobody is about to punish you, etc. But then there's that feeling that you say, oh, this is wrong. So this is going to be an important aspect of human existence that we are going to trace all the way to Immanuel Kant and his moral philosophy later in the semester. But here there is something that is happening that is very crucial. You don't do something because your gods who happened to be there at that particular time in ancient Athens tell you to do it or not to do it. But then there is a voice in you as a human being, as someone who can think and feel for themselves, to say not to do something. That is kind of conscience. That is the first time the sort of authority in terms of thinking is going inward. Namely, I can decide for myself rather than needing an external authority. So that's why they think that you are inventing new gods. And then continues, so he has written this indictment against you, who makes innovations in religion's matter, and he comes to court to slander you. So Euthyphro is taking the side of Socrates. Slander you, knowing such things are easily misinterpreted to the crowd. So not very many people can understand that. Here, obviously, Euthyphro has this position of, oh, I'm an expert, not everybody understands it, but I understand it. So the same is true in my case. Well, he immediately wants to talk about his case, obviously. And I'm sure that you notice that with people, whenever you tell them something, they go, yeah, I understand what you are saying, but let me tell you what I feel. So that's the kind of like, let's talk about me. It's enough about you. I don't want to really hear your case, etc. I really want to talk about my case. That I think was funny. But he asked for it too. Like Socrates didn't ask. So he brings it up. So he really puts himself on the spot, Euthyphro does, and says, the same is true in my case. Whenever I speak of divine matters in the assembly and foretell the future, they laugh me down as if I were crazy. And yet I have foretold nothing did not happen. Nevertheless, the envy of all of us who do this. One need not to worry about them, but meet them head on. So he says, like, we are these special people. We predict the future. We understand the piety or whatever, the divine matters, he says. So Socrates obviously says, like, I have nothing to say about the future. I am not a prophet. I don't see the future. The only thing that I know is that when I'm about to do something, some voice in me says, don't do it. And that's the sort of negative voice. Now, then he says, what is your case? This is on page 4 in the initial one, that's 5 in the new one. It is marginal number 3. E. Perhaps it will come to nothing, Socrates, blah, blah. What is your case, Euthyphro? Are you the defendant or the prosecutor? So he is the prosecutor. He is prosecuting his father. And you understand, right? He's the guy that kills somebody, the servant kills a slave, and then he doesn't know what to do. He needs to ask some seer. I mean, they really sort of had that notion of like someone who sees the future would make a determination of what should be the case. So he puts him in a room or something, he shackles him, and then he dies. So what do you think about this case? So should someone prosecute his own father or their own father for not exactly killing, but killing a servant? I mean, Euthyphro is pretty cool, actually. I mean, in this game. He says, like, so what? Like, why shouldn't I do it to my father? I mean, he's my father. Or is it important who he killed? Even though the person who he killed was a murderer himself, that shouldn't matter. So what kind of a case does it appear to be? Would you?
Well, I was a little bit confused by, I guess, the legal system that was going on here, because at least in my experience, like, especially for a crime like murder, if my father, God forbid, murdered a guy, I wouldn't be the one that actually took up those charges. That would be the role of, depending on who he actually killed. Most likely it would be, the state government. But, let's say he killed the mailman or some federal employee, then probably the federal government. But I think just conceptually, do I understand it that in this case, it's like, it's more on it's more on you as an individual to decide whether or not you want to bring that to the attention of the authorities, or?
Well, you are not really a simple individual in the sense that we understand individual today. You are a citizen. As a citizen, you have the obligation for the ruling of the city-state. So in Athens, it's technically, if it is democracy, it is really ruled by people. So yes, I'm not really an expert on Greek jurisprudence, but as I understand it, you are responsible as a citizen for the running of your, it's not even a country, but city-state. So this is about 50,000 people. And as you will see in the case of, it explains it a little bit at the beginning of Apology, there's like 500 jury members listening to Socrates' case, selected out of all the free citizens. Of course, Greeks had slaves as well. So, and those 500 people decided, and it was not really like a judge or a prosecutor, etc. You just, as a citizen, settle your issues with each other. And it is interesting, like now, you don't even have to make that decision, as you said, God forbid, if your father does anything, you don't have to make that decision because somebody is making that for you. I guess we just sort of gave that up. So because the presumption is that if it is your father or someone close to you, you wouldn't do it. So would you, should you? Is that like, if we look at it from our perspective today, is this something that is like, okay, yeah, cool, Euthyphro, right on, continue?
I think from our perspective today, like I personally don't think I could, even though like I feel like in some instances like that would be the correct like thing to do. What?
Do you think that it is the correct thing to do?
Well, I think that this is how we've set up our government and this is how we've been living. And in a way, we choose to be here and live here. So we do have to oblige by the rules to some extent.
Sure,
but,
that's what Socrates says too. That's
yeah.
Yeah.
But for that time, like Socrates says later in the text, when he brings up Zeus and Kronos, how they obviously dismantled their fathers and killed them and whatnot, all the gory details. So for Euthyphro to do the same thing, would it make sense that if he wanted to be as powerful as the gods, like he has seen the gods do it, so he wants to like be like them, kind of.
No, that's
so it would seem just to him to do it because that's what the gods did, and you have to look up to the gods, especially in that time when they were so like highly looked upon, which they still are now.
But I think that another thing to consider is, and I think what Socrates was really getting at is questioning that line of thinking, and his whole point about, is it pious because it's loved by the gods, or is it loved by the gods because it's pious? And that whole point. And so even though Euthyphro might look to the gods' actions and be like, okay, well, they did it, so then I should do it, that still doesn't necessarily make it right. And then Socrates was also questioning about the whole idea that different gods might look upon different things in different ways. And so it's almost like he's selectively choosing which ones he decides to please.
Well, you are both absolutely right. I mean, you don't really contradict each other. You are just sort of complementing, because that's precisely, as Maya said, why Euthyphro is doing it, because he is sort of, if not imitating, but taking gods as a role model. And that's a very famous story. It's actually a story that sort of defines our civilization. You always kill your father. You have to somehow, either actually or in the case of God, or symbolically. That's the way in which you become an independent person, citizen. You just sort of cut off the authority that tells you what to do, and then by cutting it off, you establish your own rule. So Zeus did this to Kronos, Kronos did that to Uranus, and all that. So that's a very sort of ancient story. So he's trying to imitate that. But on the other hand, that's precisely Socrates' question, as Riley says, just because they do it, does that make it right? So now let's think about that for a second, because there's a lesson or some kind of a reflection that might be here for us. Like, we always have this notion that sort of always, as a philosopher, bothered me, like role models. Who are your role models? Like, you do something somebody else does because you take that person as a role model. And that's precisely the problem of why we cannot think for ourselves. Because we say, oh, I'm just going to imitate it. It's sort of like an almost religious kind of approach to, like, oh, I need a model. It's like, why do you need a model? Why do you need to model your behavior on someone? Like, oh, I really want to know what you think because I value your opinion. I'm going to do what you do. It's like, why? Why is it that I need something like that in order to behave or act?
I think a lot of times people like look up to role models either because they see that like they're successful or they're doing things that that person wishes that they could do, or maybe they just don't really want to take responsibility for their own actions and their own choices. Like, oh, this person said that this is okay, so you know, if I'm doing this, I'm not really acting on my own morals. I'm following the morals of this person that I admire.
Okay, that's it. That's exactly the explanation. And now what happens? Almost always, let's say more often than not, with the role model.
I think more often than not, you know, like your role models don't really live up to your expectations.
Yeah, they never do. For some reason, they always screw up somehow. Like, it's like, oh, I can't believe you did that. I mean, you build up this thing, this person, etc. And then obviously, inevitably, they are going to do something that you are not going to approve. And then all of a sudden, you're like, oh, you were my role model. I'm crushed. I'm destroyed, etc. But you just set yourself up for that. And that's precisely the beginning of this question of piety. I think religion is a little bit like that. I think it's the same kind of model in the sense, especially, I mean, I'm not an expert, but as far as I can observe, in the Christianity, because Christianity has a peculiarity among other religions that God manifests himself as a person in the body of Jesus Christ, that you can always like look at that. Some religions like Islam is like, there's Muhammad, but nobody's really trying to imitate Muhammad because he's a prophet. I can't really be like him anyway. I don't know what he was doing. I'm just following the teachings. But in the case of Christianity, that is interesting that you have this role model. Now, Socrates is really sort of moving away from that, both moving away from the religious thinking. Now, it's important to say that religion here is not like a question of faith, because anybody can believe whatever in terms of what will happen after death. Socrates says, I don't know, and I should not be afraid of something that I don't know. But here we are talking about religion in terms of determining human behavior in the world. So throughout the class, you'll hear me talk about religion in relation to philosophy, and no surprise that I take this side of philosophy. but that's not because I'm sort of against any faith, any kind of belief after life, etc. It's really how we organize our lives in this world. And it is not so much how you organize your lives, I mean, that's also up to you, but how we politically and socially organize our lives, and morally. So why it is problematic to read these principles from religion rather than from human reason. And that's what we are going to discuss. And that's an open question. And for those of you who are of some or another faith, you are always welcome to sort of bring that up and talk about it, etc. I don't want you to feel like, oh, we don't talk about faith in this class because it's looked down upon or anything like that. It's just that how we organize politics, how we organize social life, how we organize human relationships, because faith is a matter of human individual in the 21st century. It's your faith as a person, which is fine. What I'm talking about is really a relation between two people who may or may not be of the same faith. And that complicates things beyond respecting somebody's opinions, because you really, or beliefs, that you cannot really sort of operate on the assumption of like it only my faith counts. Because if the person in front of you is of no faith or a different faith, that complicates things enormously. So now that brings us to the question of, tell me then, Socrates says, you seem to know what, I mean, he says like, I don't know, I'm being indicted, I'm in trouble. So I really need somebody who teach me what is pious, what is not, what is godly, what is not. And you seem to know because you are prosecuting your own father and you are saying that, you know, you should do, I mean, he's not even saying like, he could be saying like, Euthyphro, oh, you have to prosecute your father because it's the right thing to do. And the right thing there is justice that Socrates brings up later in the dialogue. Here he says, because it's pious, because it's the godly, it's what would gods do, and as Maya said, what Zeus did to Kronos, so why shouldn't I do it? So he gives his justification from religion, not from any kind of rational principle that you should prosecute everybody who kills somebody. So on page 5, you think your knowledge of the divine and of piety and impiety is so acute that when those things happen, as you say, you have no fear of having acted impiously in bringing father to trial. So what is Euthyphro? Euthyphro is certain of himself. He is so certain of himself, he thinks that he knows so well that he can even indict and prosecute his own father. That's precisely the certainty that Socrates questions. So it is not so much whether you did this or that, you may or may not do that, but the kind of approach that you take to it. And then Euthyphro is, oh, I'm certain. So he says, I should be of no use, Socrates, and Euthyphro not be superior to the majority of men if I did not have accurate knowledge of all such things. I mean, he's asking for it. He is sort of like setting himself up, and he's like, I have an accurate knowledge of this. I know. I mean, if I didn't know, I wouldn't do this. I would be useless. Of course I know. So what is the most basic question to ask? What is it that you know? And that's really the philosophical question, which we are going to clarify a little bit. See, so this is on page 5, marginal number 5. But in the text, if you are using PDF, it's still the marginal number. So you can ask, like, what is pious? What is piety? Now, one way to ask that question, and the answer that he gives is like, what I'm doing is pious. That is giving an example. This is not, I mean, we are talking about pious just by accident here because of the dialogue, but it could be anything. Like when I tell to you, what is brown, or what is red, or what is a tree, what you would say is that, oh, this is brown, this is a tree, this is red, or this is what pious is, namely what I'm doing, prosecuting my own father. Now, that's the one answer where you are asking about a concept, and you are giving as an example and giving as an answer an example. Now, this is not piety. This is one example of piety. So what Socrates is trying to get Euthyphro to see, and the philosophical moment, is that when I ask what is knowledge, or what is beautiful, what is a tree, the answer, the philosophical answer, is not, oh, this is knowledge, 2 + 2 is 4, that's knowledge. That's not the answer. That's an example. So, I am eager to become your pupil, my dear friend. I know that other people, as well as this Meletus, do not even seem to notice you, whereas he sees me sharply and clearly that he indicts me for ungodliness. So tell me, by Zeus, what you just now maintained you clearly knew. What kind of thing do you say that godliness and ungodliness are, both as regards murder and other things? Both as regards to murder and other things. Or is the pious not the same and alike in every action? Here's something very important happening. There is something common to all pious acts. And the impious, the opposite of all that is pious and like itself. And everything that is so impious presents us with one form or appearance insofar as it is impious. So the question of what is piety is asking what is common, what is the form of all actions that we call just. Prosecuting your father might be just. Not cheating during the exam might be just. Not belittling people because of their faith or anything else might be just. But what is justice that is common to all of these actions? That is the conceptual element. Now, this is important because we always confuse this. In fact, I would argue most of our public debate is as a result of this confusion. Namely, what is justice when somebody was forced to ask or answer, you immediately have one example in mind. So I want to ask you, for example, in the context of the United States nowadays, a lot of people are talking about racial justice in the United States. Do we even know what that would be like? Do we even any sense in the terms of justice? Because we have certain examples of what we should do. Namely, we should do this or we should not do that. We should blah, blah, all the things that may or may not be true. But what that would be like, what is the concept of justice that is common in the sense that this society is going to be organized according to some principle of justice? Or is it possible to have justice in any society just in terms of one aspect of it? Namely, is it possible that we are racially justice but sexually aren't? Or we are economically just but politically not just? Is it possible? Is it possible to just fix the issue of race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever in the United States without thinking all other aspects of society that is just?
I don't think so, because I think that, like, one person is connected to so many different identities. Like you could connect to a racial justice perspective. You could also connect to sexual assault perspective. Like all of those things could apply to one person. And I think that like they're so much more connected than just like, oh, we can look at one in particular and then solve it without looking at this other one. Because like maybe this person will receive justice in this one way, but then they have all of these other ways that they really are not being seen. And so I think it's very, very connected.
That's how we think today in terms of the individual. That is absolutely correct. If you just take one step, I don't know which direction, back or forth, whatever. If you just take one step away and sort of think about society, can a society be just in one respect and not so in another? I mean, it might function better because we believe, like, okay, so we believe, I mean, let's just say we don't believe it, but like some people believe, like maybe in the United States, let's just say, oh, we made a lot of headway in terms of, I don't know, I don't want to offend anybody and say something that is problematic. Like we made a lot of progress in one domain. Like, let's just say, I don't know. What do you want to say? I don't want to say, what do you want to say? What do you think like the United States as a society made progress in? Let's imagine that it did in one respect, to be named X. So is it possible that we are a just society in one X way, but not in Y? Is it possible of all the things that we are discussing, like race, gender, sexual orientation, etc., is it possible that we can achieve this kind of justice or whatever harmony in those areas without having economic justice?
Well, I think it undermines the whole like reason for being just and like having justice with it. Like, why would you give justice to one aspect of a person and not the other if you really understand why you're going to give justice? And like in that regards, I don't know if that made sense, but
no, it doesn't.
Like I think it that also has to do with like what Socrates is trying to say about like being pious. Like, how can you be pious when there are all of these other sides that you still don't understand and you can't attest to? So like I think justice, I think I would say justice is like a quick fix when you just like label it to a certain grouping when you're not assessing the whole situation of it.
I mean, you are thinking from the perspective of the society, modern society or contemporary society, which is absolutely good from the perspective of the individual. But if you try to think of it in terms of the entire society, not from the individual, but can a society be just? Or is it possible to be just in one respect, but not in another for the society, independently of the individual? Like, I'm coming to the United States from abroad. I said, well, the United States is really good in, I don't know what to say, but like just, I mean, it's not seem to be very good in anything nowadays. So I don't want to sort of come up with something that is, oh, so like, compared to Turkey, let's just say, compared to Turkey, United States might be better off in terms of women's rights. Women's rights. Okay, I'll say it because I'm from Turkey, so whatever. So, women's rights. Now, is it possible? Oh, but racially, oh, that's really worse. Like, is it even possible to evaluate a society to be good in one respect without, or just without really thinking about other. And economically, yeah, you'll be screwed if you are sick in the United States if you don't have insurance. In Turkey, at least, there is universal health care, so you can be taken care of. So how do we even, now, again, I'm just leaving these as questions in a very Socratic way. So I'm not sort of trying to push you to make a determination about Turkish society, American society, or any society whatsoever. It's just that these are the kinds of questions that emerge philosophically to be able to make connections. And that connection is this: what is pious, what is the impious? And Euthyphro says immediately, I say that the pious is to what I'm doing now, to prosecute the wrongdoer, be it about murder or temple robbery or anything else, whether the wrongdoer is your father or your mother or anyone else, not to prosecute the impious. This is really a typical answer. What is piety? What I'm doing. What I'm doing is just. And what I'm doing is justice. Now I'm using these terms like they're not interchangeable. Of course, it's important that Euthyphro only uses piety, but it will be, I want to make connections to other discussions that we are going to have. So, indeed, Euthyphro, that's the case. However, if you, who have full knowledge of such things, share their opinions, then we must agree with them too. So, first of all, the question is, okay, so there are a couple of complications. First, what you give as an example is not piety as a definition, but it's an example. So he says, what is dear to God is what is dear to God is pious, and what is not is impious. So that is a general enough definition that would cover not just Euthyphro's case, but all the other cases. What is dear to God? Now, what is the immediate implications of that?
What is dear to one God will not be dear to another God.
Okay, so I assume that this is pretty clear. And especially if you know, even if you don't know, but if you imagine more than one God, like why do you need more than one God unless they are disagreeing with each other? So in the ancient Greece, there is a certain understanding of the gods as multiple, and then what is dear to gods cannot be. So what if they are in contention with each other, etc.? So what would that lead to? How would Euthyphro get out of that problem? It's a very small change of a word that changes the whole thing. What is dear to God doesn't work. What do we need?
He says what is dear to all gods is
all of the gods. Okay, so when you add all, that means, you know, all gods agree. So that's really dealing with that specific complication of polytheism. So of course, you know, in this very small way, you see the idea of, if you want to define concepts like piety, justice, etc., in the way that we understand them today, we cannot really have more than one God. So the move to polytheism, from polytheism to monotheism, is really a sort of human desire, human need, that we need to find one standard. We cannot have the same action to be pious at one point and not pious at another point, according to what God wants. Now think about that, for example. Can you conceive an act that is just at one point and is not at another?
Perhaps pulling a fire alarm if there is a fire would be just, but if there is no fire, that would not be just.
Okay. Okay, let me make it a little bit more complicated. If there is a fire, you should pull it. If there is no fire, you should not pull it. That seems pretty.
Right.
It's possible that the same act, like pulling, I mean, this is an example that you gave, pulling the fire would be, pulling the fire alarm during the, during fire would be just, and at some point, not just. There is still fire. Like in both cases, there is fire.
Perhaps that could be true.
You just want to give the possibility, but you don't want to comment. So, but I mean, think about this for a second. This is a sort of philosophical conundrum. On the one hand, you think an act should be just under all circumstances. The same act that was considered to be just cannot be unjust at any given, another point. But there you are evaluating rationally from a one principle of what justice is, and it is always the case. Now, in that case, you explain the historical changes in terms of, oh, we didn't know. So, for example, let's just say, I don't know, your that all people should vote. In a democracy, all people should be allowed to vote. Is that a just principle? Now, previously, not all people were allowed to vote. Was that just? No. So we did not know what justice was. We learned or we improved. It was always right. Just because we did it differently in the past doesn't make it right. It was a law, it was lawful, but it wasn't fair. We just didn't match our conception of law with fairness. Now we do. Right? So that doesn't hurt the principle. Now, is it possible that everybody in a country should vote be both a just principle and unjust principle? Yes.
I think it can be in terms of you're looking at voting and how it can be so much more accessible in certain places. Like, for example, in some counties, there's a lot more polling places, and so it's a lot easier. But in others, like, there's a lot less and it's a lot harder. And maybe even right now, too, like, maybe your coronavirus rates are higher. And so there's more of a chance that you're going to get the coronavirus if you go vote.
But does that change the principle that everybody should be able to vote?
No.
I mean, everybody should be allowed to vote.
Yeah.
Well, should everybody be allowed to vote? Am I supposed to vote?
I'd say that if you're like directly involved in like the system, then yes, you should be able to vote.
What does directly involved mean? I'm not a citizen.
Well, yeah, but like if you live here, then I think that you should be allowed to vote.
Well,
because you were here and you're like affected.
No, I mean, I appreciate that personally. Thank you. But what we do is, if I'm not a citizen, I'm not allowed to vote. So should we give voting rights to non-citizens?
Well, I think that if they're in the US, then yes, because they're still affected by the system here.
So what if I came like yesterday? Should I be able to vote? What if I came a month ago? What if I came a year ago? What if 1 million of us came yesterday to Wayne County? Should we be able to vote here? Because there are like 40,000 people in Wayne County anyway. I mean, I don't know how many, but like 50,000 people will immediately change the entire result of the election. So we have a principle. We use the principle, but we always have qualifications to that principle. We always have to think that that principle has to be questioned. And that's really the issue, because sometimes things appear to be beautiful and nice. We say it and we love it. What is pious? What is dear to God? Isn't that easy? Isn't that a beautiful answer? It's a lazy answer. It is not an adequate answer, but it sounds good. I mean, let's just do what is dear to God, to all of them, as if there's only one God. It is dear to all of them. Then the question is, does that make it what it is? Namely, isn't there something with piety which he now understands in terms of righteousness? Just because it is dear to God, does it make it right? Does it make it righteous? So he says on page 10, marginal number A, we shall soon better whether it is. Consider this. Is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods? And that's really the sort of question, because God loves what is pious. Just because God loves something doesn't make it pious. That's the distinction. So here the concept of piety philosophically takes precedence over the preference of God. Now we encounter this problem because we make changes to even our religions, right? We don't do all the things that ostensibly our religion does, because our religion might say, you should not, I don't know, bunch of things, like you should not work on Saturday or something, whatever. So we just say, yeah, we are not going to follow that principle, because that doesn't appear to be rational, reasonable, etc. So what is it that we decide, like, if I don't follow all the principles of my religion, it's okay? My religion doesn't say, my religion says don't kill. Now I'll stick to that. I like that. I'm going to keep that. But my religion says that thou shalt never lie with another man or something like that. I'm not going to keep that. How do we make that discrimination? How do we say that certain principles are to be followed and significant, and certain principles aren't? Because all of them are dear to God, but some of them don't matter. Alvaro, do you have something to say? No.
Maybe it just has to do with the weight of the action it has when someone does it. Because if I lie to someone, it's not as severe. But if I go about murdering people, it has more of a weight on you and a representation of who you are as a person.
Sure, absolutely. But you decide. I mean, you don't ask God, like, okay, which of your principles are really cool, like I should follow, but which of them are like, I shouldn't follow? Like, if you have that kind of, and then like God would say, well, I made up these rules, but this is really important, but the other one is not as important. That's not how it works, right? So we only have like one source and we read it from there, etc. So here's, with all this discussion about carried and being carried, something is carried because someone carries it. Now, this is the sort of opposite of the argument. God loves what is pious, it is not pious because God love it. It is pious, therefore God love it. So all these analogies that he gives should not really confuse you. It's not really that relevant. On page 12, he explained this very easily. It is being loved then because it is pious, but it is not pious because it is being loved. It is pious. So what comes first? So something is not carried because it is carried. Something is carried because someone carries it. So it is not a tautological in the sense that, just because I love something without any reason makes it pious. God, love something because it is itself pious. It is a property that it has in and of itself. And that's really a very significant shift in our understanding of religion, because, I revealed this because this is where we are going to go at the end. So what does piety become? It is somehow doing some kind of things that are pleasing to God. That seems to be pious. And then it says on page 18, I want to hit that, we'll come back to it. Piety would then be a sort of trading skill between gods and men. Now imagine this. If you are doing an act because it is pleasing to God, you are doing it out of fear because gods are going to punish you. You are doing it to get on the good side of God and go to heaven. It's a transaction. It's a trade. You have some selfish reasons for doing something because you are afraid of the consequences. And if you are doing that because you are a God-fearing, that's like what people use, which always surprised me, like, why should fear determine your actions? It's the right thing to do. You should do it. What if I don't fear God? Do I not have the obligation to be just? Do I not have the obligation to follow those rules? So here, Plato is moving towards an understanding of morality, doing just and right things, independently of any transactional value it has. Now, Euthyphro is sort of a self-serving person who is doing it in order to look good for God. But the question is, does that make it fair? Does that make it just? So, going back to 12, page 12. So, then God loved is not the same as the pious, nor the pious the same as God loved. As you say it, one differs from another. So, should we take a break? I can't go 3 hours nonstop. So how about we take about till like 9:30? You can like disconnect and connect again if you are having trouble with your or I can make an entire new session, which might be a little bit more difficult. So once you disconnect, you can come back, right? Yeah, so I'm going to keep mine on because I'm at school, so it doesn't matter. But if you are having issues with your internet, like if you are abroad, etc., you are using from your home and you don't want to use it, you can disconnect. So let's just take about 15-minute break. Okay. So the conclusion that he comes to, something is pious and therefore it is loved by God. It is not just because it is loved by God doesn't make an action pious. Now he says, well, tell me again. So what Socrates does, is a very typical move in Socratic dialogues, is to question the answer, and question the answer by really asking questions. And then the person ends up admitting something that they really didn't want to admit, or they end up saying something that they contradict themselves. So he never really says, no, you're wrong because blah, blah, because my opinion is better than your opinion. And that's really how we argue nowadays. Like when somebody says something, you just say the opposite as if that's going to somehow convince that person. It never really happens that I observed, online or otherwise. People will say, this is whatever X, and then you say, no, that's Y, and the person says, oh yeah, okay, I got it. That's right. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. That like, especially with respect to matters of opinion, that really never happens. So what Socratic, genuine Socratic method does is to really, when somebody says something, to ask questions. And I think I would recommend you to try this. Like when somebody says, we should wear masks or we should not wear masks, don't yell at them and say, oh, you should wear masks and masks are horrible or something like that. But then ask questions about, what the position of the person is. That might actually prove to be a little bit, not a little, a lot more effective in terms of people getting to see for themselves why their position is contradictory. Now, what happens, obviously, what happens at the end of the dialogue, usually people run away, which is fine. I'm sure, your aim is not to really sort of preach to everybody or convince to everybody of your opinion, but somehow get them think. So that's really what Socrates is doing. So he says, well, that really didn't work because if you define pious in terms of what God's love, that could have been an answer. But it is not an answer because it is not pious because God's love it, all God's love it, but it is pious and therefore God's love it. Then the question is, you still didn't answer the initial question of what is it that makes them lovable for God? So since being loved by God is not the definition of pious, there must be another definition that we will explain, understand what pious would mean, which would make it lovable for God. And then it says, well, Euthyphro says, you make my arguments wander. They don't, it's like the Daedalus example, the Daedalus made statues that move, and you say you make the arguments move and not stay stable. I give you an answer, and by questioning it, you make it unstable, which is a good analogy, like an example, I suppose. And Socrates says, well, actually, I'm not making my arguments move. I'm making your arguments move. So I'm even better than Daedalus because he at least made his own statues move. I can make other people's statues move. So that really never happened. But, that's the sort of discussion. I'm better than Daedalus because I make your argument move. So, but then he says on page 14, marginal number 12, A, then all that is just pious, or is it that is pious just? Now, there's really also an important thing happening here. So something that is pious, religiously acceptable, pleasing to God, etc., and its relation to justice. Now, what Euthyphro wants to do is to say that piety and justice are the same. Now, what Socrates is trying to demonstrate is that piety, what is pious, is a subset of what is just. So justice, throughout Plato's writings and for Socrates and philosophically, justice turns out to be the most comprehensive understanding of human life. and not just because doing the right thing or vengeance or something like that. It is just as a concept of how people live together within a society and in terms of their lives. The term is dike, the Greek term for justice is dike, and it is much broader concept than what we think of justice today as if something happens, you have to have retribution or you have to have restoration or something like that. Justice is a harmonious living of harmonious being of human existence. So it is a much broader concept. Of course, we are just throwing it out right there. We are not really defining it or understanding it even, but it is a very important philosophical concept that we are actually going to trace in the course through more contemporary writings. So he says that he gives the example from Zeus. You don't really have to spend too much time in understanding the details of whether fear is shame or shame is fear. The point that he is making is that fear is a larger concept than shame. Everything that is shame is fear, but not everything that is fear is shame. So the analogy is that everything that is just is pious, but not everything that is pious is just. So that means justice is a much broader concept, much larger extension than piety. So justice is that part that of, piety is that part of justice that is pleasing to God. So of course, Euthyphro comes to the exactly the same point, obviously. So because piety is doing just acts in the care of gods, and he goes through these examples of different traits. And that is also a very typical move that Socrates makes by making analogies to different and other traits, like horsemen and the ship. And he always does that. And then the idea is that it really doesn't work that way. The analogy proves both that your case doesn't work because you are trying to make a case like justice is horsemanship or something like that, but it doesn't work that way because it concerns a different kind of relationship, a philosophical relationship. So whenever he gives these examples, don't get all like flustered, just follow it. They almost always end up in the same place by saying that this is not what it is like. So, and then he comes back to exactly the same place that piety is that of justice where you are doing things that are pleasing the gods, like he gives the example like the slaves take care of the masters. We are the slaves of gods. We are just doing certain things for gods. That's piety, doing sacrifice, doing prayer, doing religious ceremonies, rituals, etc. And all these activities, at the end, he says, why do we do them? That are pleasing to gods. What do gods do? They give us what we want. And then he says, that's really kind of a trading skill. And that, to me, is like a very significant criticism of religious activities, even in the ancient Greece, with respect to multiple gods. But there is certain element that Socrates is trying to articulate. If you are doing something just to please gods, you might as well not do it. Because then you are doing it for selfish reasons, in order to be rewarded for your own good. So you are just trying to trade certain goods and services with gods. If I do this, will you do that? If I don't lie, will you take me to heaven? If I am respectful of my elders, are you going to protect me? If I pray to you, like some people pray, some people I know too. So like pray like, oh, I pray to God that I win the lottery. So it's like, seriously, like that's the kind of level at which we are trading with a higher authority. And I think that's what Plato is questioning as to whether that leads to any sense of justice. So we come back exactly to the same point. Euthyphro keeps saying what he knows, and he cannot say anything else, even if he tries, that piety is doing what is dear to God, what God loves, what is pleasing to God. And it is obviously a circular definition, because it really doesn't explain what piety is. Now, it is important because this is on the basis of which Socrates is going to die. So this is not just some theoretical exercise in which I want, like, because you are accusing me for, and you are prosecuting me, like it's literally like religious prosecution and persecution, I guess. But you don't even know what you're talking about. And I think that's a really significant criticism of anything that is happening to you personally as well. You are being subjected to certain principles by people who don't know what they are talking about. I mean, if you are in the United States now, you are obviously experiencing this profoundly, but all over the world. And we do look at our political sphere, and I think that's also a question that emerges from there. It's not really doing the right thing. We don't even expect people to do the right thing. We are really talking about transactions. Like, this is my interest, this is what I want, how much can I get for this, how likely am I going to achieve this, even if it is a question of ostensibly something about justice, that might be a racial justice, justice about other aspects of human life. We always look at it in terms of economic terms. How much is this going to cost? How much can I get for this? And how much can I hurt people transactionally in order to get them to act justly, as I perceive justice? So it is the same logic. Like, for example, the police defunding movement in the United States today. So what is the punishment for killing people unnecessarily? Money. Like, we are going to take your money away. That's the punishment. That's a transaction. And you are going to be as guilty as much amount of money that we take from you. That's that's also like how we negotiate human life in most countries, but especially in the United States. Like, how much does it cost for me to kill you? So that's a transaction. Like, will I do like 5 years in hell if I kill you? Like, the remaining time that I can spend in heaven, type of thing. So that's a, and then again, that's a question. So you don't really need to be like, as a philosopher or someone thinking self-righteous. You don't need to be sort of, I know the answer. It's just that when you see something that is problematic in society, you immediately get the sort of reactions like, so what would you do? Well, just because I don't know what I would do or what I could do or what I should do, and I'm thinking about it, doesn't mean I cannot say that something that I observe is problematic. And I think that's really what people always do to us. It's like, so how would you solve the problem of blah, blah? And it's like, I wouldn't, because maybe there is no such problem. Maybe the problem that you are articulating is a problem that you yourself cornered yourself in. So that's the sort of philosophical approach that's why Socrates is, as you will read later, turns out to be the wisest person. Just because you claim not to know anything doesn't mean that you are useless. Just because you claim not to have a positive knowledge of something, that you cannot participate in political sphere. In fact, quite the opposite. Just because you are aware of the fact that you don't know something or anything, that's the best way to participate in politics, because that's the domain of negotiation. So if you start out with the knowledge that you know what you are doing and you are certain, that's not really negotiation, that's compromise. But negotiation is really his attempt to say that people, by negotiating with each other, can come to an understanding together. Now, of course, this is a very small community where people interacting with each other. It might be pretty difficult to imagine this in a large scale. But that might be going back to the question that we were asking. How is it that you want to live? What does philosophical life imply? Just because your way of life might not fit perfectly with the configuration of things in society in the 21st century, doesn't mean it's not a good life. That doesn't mean it's not the best way to live. Perhaps that is the best way to live, despite the fact that you're probably not going to be very successful. Or you might even be killed. I mean, that's a fantasy. I don't think that you will be killed just being a philosopher today. I think you might. You never know. Okay. So then he says, okay, give me the answer. And he's like, I need to go. That's it. I'm in a hurry now. And then Socrates says, hey, I'm about to die here. I mean, he doesn't know that he's going to die, but like, I'm being indicted here. And I'm trying to learn what piety is. And I'm going to tell people that Euthyphro taught me how to be pious. And I'm going to save myself from the indictment. And you are leaving. So that's bad. Okay, any questions, comments, reflections? Anything that is unclear in the text?
I think just in general, like there's always going to be someone who has an opposing opinion and idea from you. So there's always going to be someone who's not pleased with what you're working with and what you suggest. And that's just something that kept popping into my mind while I was reading this.
No, that's a good point. I mean, in general, for our contemporary society, that is true. But in the case of Socrates, it's a little bit even more complicated. Namely, he doesn't have an opinion. He doesn't have a position. He doesn't have, I mean, he just asks questions. He doesn't say like, this is what I think, was what my opinion is. And people are still against that. I mean, in fact, it's okay, I guess, for you to have opinions. It's more dangerous if you don't even have opinions and you are questioning other people's. Because as a person, you can have your own opinion and then we'll object to it and we won't agree with it. We'll agree to disagree, blah, blah, blah. But you're even more dangerous. And someone is opposed to you in your way of being, in your way of living. If you refuse to, I mean, not have opinion, because I don't have any certainty, because opinion is like something I opinionate, something I believe. I don't have anything that I believe is to be true. That even more dangerous, I think, more dangerous and also more frustrating for people, because they say, so what do you think about racial justice in society? So there was a panel, I don't know whether you participated in it, where one of my colleagues sort of said something to be like, we need to be much more reflective about our approach to these questions and not just sort of rush to answers and certain actions. And everybody was like, no, we need to act now. We should do stuff now. That's the kind of, attitude. And the question is, that person was probably much more maligned than anybody else because he asked questions, because he asked for reflection rather than just, what's your opinion? Say it and do it and let us tell you that you are wrong. So a good point, yeah. And there's always, I mean, you're never gonna please anybody, but Socrates certainly didn't, and then they killed him.
Something that was interesting for me reading this was that, like, like having that ignorance is like such a part of who Socrates is. But like even still, like this whole conversation is like he's trying to find an answer.
Mhm.
And of course he never gets there. But I think it's so interesting how like someone with such like a signature ignorance still can like be searching for answers. And that I don't know, if I'm a little bit confused of like if that is his actual goal or if he just wants to question authority. But I thought that was something that was interesting for me reading this.
Well, that's a really good question. I'm not sure what his actual goal was as a person, but in the context of Plato, because it's the character that Plato creates, and they talk about the accuracy of the representation of Socrates, because he didn't write anything. The only things that we know came from Socrates and a few other sources, including Aristophanes. So what, when you read it for like 30 years or whatever, then you sort of say, of course he knows he's not getting anywhere. So he's just doing, but then there are moments at which, why would one even try to figure out an answer if one doesn't think one is ignorant? Because just look into yourself, like most of the time, if not all of the time, you are most ignorant about things that you think you know. And that happens, that the shortest thing to me is like whenever you are using certain words, it's a terrifying moment, especially for non-native speakers, but also native speakers too. You use a concept all the time. You use the word in your mouth constantly. And when somebody says, what do you mean by that? You are sort of horrified to realize, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I don't even know the meaning of the term. And that's really the moment in which you seek for understanding out of ignorance rather than, now, of course, it's a little bit, to me, you know, mythologized in the case of Socrates, because he says, I don't know what death is. Why should I be afraid of something I don't know? Isn't that arrogance? To be afraid of death, imagining that I know what it is. Now, I thought about that. I'm always afraid of that. I think everybody should be. But that kind of radical, like as you said, radical ignorance, like so radical ignorance that I'm not even afraid of death because I don't know what it is. That's pretty hard. That's a little bit like mythological character, I think. I don't know how you feel. Like, do you genuinely, is like, oh, I don't care about that because I don't know. But you are young enough not to think about this right now. There's COVID, you should always be careful. But like, you are young enough not to think about this, but I do a lot. And I'm like, I'm no Socrates in that regard.
I actually like went through a period my senior year where I had an entire existential crisis looking into like the different ideas behind death and like the different beliefs and philosophies. So I've thought about death a lot, but I think I kind of like moved past it, and now it's just kind of like, you know, whatever happens is gonna happen. I can't control it, so I'd rather just accept it than, I don't know, torture myself over it. So,
Well, sure. I mean, we all at some point do it because we continue with our lives, but whenever I think about it, I'm still a little afraid. So in order not to be afraid, I don't think about it. That's not really a solution because I'm getting old. So I don't know how it is with you, but that's later when we read Apology for Tuesday. By the way, next Tuesday we are going to read We are going to start apology. It's a little confusing. Just read it a couple of times for Tuesday. We'll try to cover all of it. There he talks about his relationship to death and how he is going to be punished by the jury. So he's going to the court. Now, I mean, we are following the story. So this is the first time that we hear about the fact that he's accused, he is there, etc. Now he's going to the court. There's a jury. There's a little bit of explanation at the beginning of on page, in this case, 20, 21, the beginning of apology. So forget about the page number. Just read apology, the entire apology for Tuesday, whatever the page number is. So there's something here it says about whether it is accurate in terms of whether Socrates said any of these things or whether it is Plato's invention. But one thing he says, the translator, that I laughed. We should always remember that the ancients did not expect historical accuracy in the way we do. I think that's a really strange statement. Like, why would I? Yeah. So we don't actually know, but that's okay because we are really not trying to figure out historical facts here, but trying to understand what is to be thought in terms of the questions that Socrates is raising. So for our purposes, we are not historians, and I don't know how historians decide these things, but this is what Plato wrote. That's what we are concentrating on. Okay, any other questions, comments? Those of you who are writing the protocol, are you good to go? Josh, Kylie, Ryan? Okay. Any other reflections? Yes.
I have this question about, like, as I read this, I got this impression about like Euthyphros, like what Euthyphros says is like almost like up to the examples or like or the comments that, I mean, or the questions that Socrates asks. So, and at the end of the day, what the Euthyphro says is like came back to the original point, and I just thought like maybe like Socrates like was like intended to like come back to the original point from like at the first place. And do you think like he was intending to do that, or it just happened like as a result of the discussion?
Well, Plato, who writes this, might have certainly intended that, because Plato knows that Euthyphro doesn't know what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And he has one answer. And he is going to not be able to move beyond that answer. He's going to come back to that answer. Now, of course, we don't know how Socrates would have moved beyond that answer. But at this point, I just want to emphasize the philosophical moment in which the nature of the question changes. Namely, when we say, what is justice? We almost always answer that question with an example.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever answer we provide is going to be partial.
Mm-hmm.
So it might turn out to be justice is a process, a dialogue, not a state of being. So it cannot be permanent. It cannot be achieved once and for all as forever, but it is that process of questioning. It is when we don't question justice that we are not just. And we can actually observe this very well in political domain. Like, United States has as a country, always had an identity issue with race. It was always there. Now that for the time being, although for different reasons, it's being questioned now, doesn't mean, I mean, that question of justice emerged now. That doesn't mean all the elements were not there. That doesn't mean all the things that we are concerned about now, ostensibly, were not happening last year, the year before, the year before, the year before, for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it is when we question it, when we start questioning it, then the question of justice emerges. So the United States didn't become unjust in the last 12 months or 4 years or whatever. So yeah, he doesn't have an answer. I mean, obviously no one can have an answer, but at least some people can acknowledge that they don't have the answer. But not having answer doesn't allow you to do whatever you want. And that's really the key issue here. It's like, for Socrates, it will really make you much more cautious so that he will never take anybody to the court. But for us, it's sort of like, oh, we don't know what justice is, I can do whatever I want. That's when we use power to substitute justice. So so we'll read Apology for Tuesday and then Crito for Thursday. And as you read Crito, please read the remaining 1, 2, 4 pages of Phaedrus and finish the book. So by next week, we'll finish the book. So it might be actually a lot easier if you have the weekend to read the entire thing and then come back to it on Tuesday. So we'll do Apology and then Crito. In Crito, he says something which I underlined 19 years ago, and now on September 11, 2001. Do you remember September 11? So were you even born? No, right? Who was born in 2001? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, good. Okay, fine. I mean, but you still don't remember. So it really doesn't matter. So he says, nor must one, when wronged, inflict wrong in return, as the majority believe, since one must never do wrong. This is on page 49, and that's where we are trying to get at, which is like something he says. It doesn't positively define what justice is. It doesn't positively define what the right thing is, but it just says this, like, nor must one, when wronged, inflict wrong in return, as the majority believe, since one must never do wrong. So when they asked me to speak after 9/11 at school here at Arnhem, so I remember you using this quotation, because when you are wronged, you are more likely to do wrong things. Don't do the wrong thing just because you are wronged. That's important. That sounded like a preaching, but it's Socrates. Any other comments? I can tell from your facial expressions that you have questions. Okay, since this new format gives us a lot of time, and one of the things that happens in some classes, especially during the this lockdown and while we are so far away from each other, you just go ahead at the end and think about the course evaluations and write things, etc., which is almost always useless because I'm mostly don't read them. But when I read them, it's already too late for to do anything. So I'm really looking for feedback in terms of how this is working, how the material is working, how the mechanics of the class is working, how much you are getting out of it. For some of you, this is one of the 2 classes that you are taking, I suppose, during the first 7 weeks. So, and since we have so much time and contact time that is allocated for the class, I want to make sure that you are like not lost, that you are not sort of disappearing, because it's very hard to, track all of you. So I want to make sure that if you have any issues, any problems, you bring it up right away. Any issues, any problems, any questions, any concerns? Nope, everything is good. I mean, I should not assume that silence means approval, so please.
I'm just wondering if you are planning on continuing the class in person or online, or if you haven't decided yet.
Yeah, what do you think?
I was gonna say I kind of prefer online because it's nice to be, it's just easier for me instead of like being in the classroom with a mask on trying to be a part of class. But I'm good with whatever other people think too.
I
Yeah.
also I also agree. I think that like obviously I'm at home, so I'm online fully, and it just felt like these conversations today were a lot more like conversable with everyone online than having people like half of the class in the classroom where like I couldn't really hear what they were saying, and that it just like it wasn't as cohesive for me as like today was, where like I really could hear and then like we could like really go back and forth more.
Okay.
For me, it was easier to understand and be able to listen. But like for some reason in the classroom, I just kept like spacing out. But here, I was able to pay attention.
Isn't that strange? Like you say, it is easier to follow here. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. No. I mean, I'm fine either way. I'm on campus, as you can see, so I can walk to the that god awful building that I hate. No offense to any science people, but I love my office too, so I can do it here too. I think part of it is the idea that since some of you came to campus for various reasons and staying on campus, paying money, etc., it would not be fair to just have it online unless you want it. So I played by ear. I don't care either way. To me, it's a little bit more cohesive online because I'm used to this and I feel more comfortable than I did before. And it is kind of weird to see all of you with your mask on in the classroom, but I like that too. So I'm not opposed to that either. So anybody who is like, no, we should definitely have face-to-face. You don't want to get up and walk to the class. You could much rather sleep in front of.
I mean, I would like to, but how can I walk to class? Like, should I take, like supersonic speed to go to class every morning? I don't know. I still prefer, going class face to face because of the interaction. It's just more natural.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and
are you on campus?
I mean, I'm actually at home now, so it's like 9:30, 13 p.m. So
Where is
yeah,
home? Where is home?
in Vietnam. So basically, like
Oh,
half around of Earth. So yeah.
yeah. I wasn't really asking to you. So those of you who are not on campus don't really have a chance to come face to face. I was just asking to people who are on campus that you say, hey, I came all the way to the campus. I want to see your face to face in the classroom, which is to me like a reasonable argument. But for those of you who are not, I will always have the online component that I will certainly have, because some people are better there and some people cannot like fly from Vietnam every Tuesday and Thursday.
I mean, I would prefer having it in person, but also since half the class is online, it would be hard to do both at once.
We tried on Tuesday. I'll do better next Tuesday if I do face to face, because I might sort of reflect the screen or something like that. But when I do face to face, it is very hard for people to follow online. I imagine, as Maya said, that's not as cohesive. And you also see me from the side.
True, so online would probably work better in that case then.
Well, we'll try again on Tuesday, doing face to face. I don't want to make a decision without having like a sample of cases, and your opinion might change too. Well, those who are on campus. So as I will on Tuesday, we'll meet. We'll meet in person. I mean, we'll meet both, and then there will be a protocol, and somebody is going to read the protocol. Now, I'm not really sure that during protocol it is a best way to have both of them. So let me think about this, because one of you is going to read it, and actually online might be much easier to follow. But those of you who write the protocol, please email them before class on Tuesday. Okay, Riley, Josh. So if you don't want to like express your opinion publicly, you can always contact me and say, I really want the face-to-face version or something. Because usually what happens with the discussion is that when 3 or 4 people agree, then you sort of become more silent, because otherwise you are going to bring a differing opinion, and that becomes more difficult. So you just have to agree with people. You don't have to. I want to hear what you really think. So. Okay, about the reading, any difficulty so far? Anybody had, other than a few places where the language becomes confusing, you had difficulties in understanding the material? No? Okay, what I will do is to take another short break. Well, maybe not that short, maybe. And then at 10:30, I will give you a sort of introduction to what you are going to read, and to sort of pose a couple of questions to guide you how you are going to read the material. And that might help you as you read Apology and Crito. So that will be a sort of pre-introduction to the material for Tuesday and next week. And that will be it. So unless there are any questions, let's take about, I'll probably not need more than half an hour, if that. So let's come back at 10:30, in 12 minutes and then have another like 20 minutes or so. Okay? All right. It is divided into three parts. The first part that he is giving his main speech, why his resistance and rejection of the charges against him. And as you see the charges, you might sort of think, well, yes, maybe not believing in God might be a little bit serious, but like charges like studying things in the sky and below the earth, making the stronger argument, the weaker argument stronger, etc. You might sort of say, oh, maybe this is not really a good enough reason to kill somebody. And I think the trial seems to be political more than anything else. People are really sort of losing legitimacy and power when questioned. So that's the response. So he gives his main speech up to, as they say, 38, page 38b. And then it is customary after they find it guilty, each person asks for the punishment. And the defense also has, like Socrates in this case, has a choice to propose a punishment, and the jury decides between the two. Obviously, he says, I should be given free meal, and I should be left alone, and I should keep doing what I'm doing, etc. The jury goes with Meletus and then decides against him. And then he talks a little bit about what the punishment should be, and then he concludes in the last 3 or 4 pages about the death sentence and what that means. So those are the things that you need to pay attention. But to just set it up a little bit, so it is a political context in which a trial is really a sort of understanding of Greek democracy. So Plato writes this, and obviously he writes it as a kind of defense of his teacher. It's really, apology is not really enough to apologize, but it is really the defense, as it is explained at the bottom of the page. So the defense is somehow questioning this idea of democracy. And this issue will come up a lot, and that's going to be a very significant philosophical problem, because we somehow observe all the difficulties with a democratic way of ruling any political organization, but in this case, the state, and also seeing the problems of majority. Why majority deciding something somehow never really works in the articulation of justice within a society. So that they kill him. So by majority vote, they decide to kill him. So this is a beginning of a tradition throughout history. So the Greek notion of democracy, but what otherwise called sort of rules like liberalism, in the sense that there are certain fundamental principles of any so-called democratic system which are not democratic but must be accepted. Namely, majority cannot do whatever they want. And so this is really what we are negotiating throughout the history, actually, since the Greeks, in terms of a political question. Namely, there are certain decisions that majority can make, but there are certain decisions that majority cannot make. And it is never going to be just 51% of the people deciding that from now on this society is going to be like this, etc. Now, this poses various problems. So problems on the sense that not being able to do things that we should be able to do, but also doing things that we should not be doing. So it really doesn't solve any problem, this kind of negotiation between majority and the principles, etc. But it really opens up a number of philosophical problems about how we should rule any society. Now, with respect to, I don't know, any other organization, we really don't have any expectation for it to be democratic. We expect them to follow certain rules, but you don't expect Facebook to be democratic. You don't expect Amazon to be democratic. You don't expect Earlham College to be democratic. You don't expect local bagel shop to be democratic. There is a certain political dimension that is at stake in the expectation of democracy, namely that we should be treated equally, not according to Google, not according to Facebook, but according to some principle. That principle is the beginning of the notion of state and the beginning of citizenship, etc. But here, Plato has always been criticized for not being democratic enough, and he was always criticized for that being because of Socrates actually being killed by majority. So majority doesn't mean that it is making the right decision. And that's going to be the problem both in Apology, as he talks, but then in Crito, more importantly, he believes that the fact that people believe something or not has nothing to do with its truth. And that's a radical kind of departure from this democratic understanding of consensus. Like, for example, one of the examples that is relevant is when today people say, oh, scientists say, the majority of the scientists say this is the case. Now, that argument should not be formulated in terms of majority. That argument should be formulated in terms of this is the scientifically more viable position. Because when you say majority, then you are really reducing it to the opinion of the people, whereas you should be evaluating a statement on the basis of its potential truth. So the majority believes it doesn't make it true, and it's not even a justification. It might be an indication that since it is true, a lot of scientists believe it, but just because a lot of scientists believe it doesn't make it scientifically even correct. So that's Socrates' position here in terms of they are accusing me of this or that, etc. And you might think that. In fact, you should think that, Because yes, I am a threat to your authority, majority of you, but precisely because of that, I am necessary for the state, because as you are subjected to these questions of your authority, you are more likely to make your authority more legitimate. And that's also the sort of paradox of the philosophical position, because just because you question something doesn't necessarily mean you make it weaker. Initially, perhaps you make it weaker, but in a different way, because they respond to those criticisms, you make the authority more legitimate. And in a bizarre way, Socrates really, in Crito, accepts the authority of the state. He doesn't escape. The reason for that is that he ultimately accepts the overall structure of authority, at least in terms of its potential philosophical value. Now, if you are going to be a legitimate authority, you should allow radical questioning. And that allowing of radical questioning will make your authority stronger. That's the political position. So if certain politicians don't allow to be questioned, it's because they are weak, not because they are strong. And that's really the kind of paradox of so-called authoritarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes are not powerful. They are violent, but they are not powerful. In fact, regimes that are most efficient don't even give you the impression that they are exercising power over you. And because they are not violent, they are ruling by consent and convincing citizens, and they are more likely to be open criticism, because ironically, criticism makes you stronger. And that's Socrates' position. So that's why me being against the state, or not against the state, but against certain people who exercise power within the state, doesn't make me an enemy of the state or question the gods, etc. And I think the same is true in, I would say, religion, because people who question their faith are much stronger in their faith than people who don't, because though that faith can be diminished very quickly because it has never been exposed to questioning, but those who do it. So yes, I believe that as a principle, philosophy is, as I said last time, opposition, in the sense that it is not in power, but in opposition. But that doesn't mean that it serves a purpose that undermines the power structure or the authority necessarily. In fact, it might be that it makes it stronger, because it is not really based on any dogmas. It is based on continuous response to people's demands. So ironically, the most efficient power is the one that it doesn't look like power. It looks like negotiation or some kind of consent of the people who are here. So, like, I mean, in terms of teaching, you can think of that too. So, like, there will be some teachers who say, this is what you are going to do, and if you don't do it, I'm going to fail you, and you're terrible, and blah, blah. You probably don't, drop the class or whatever, and you probably won't. But they don't really have power, because they have so-called authority and have to exercise that authority powerfully and violently. But if you really sort of have this understanding of your relationship to people, then make no mistake, this is not lack of power. This is actually exercise of power, but not from an authoritarian position. So we'll talk about that, this question of power. But in this case, when he says, like, you should let me be, that would be the best thing for you to do. This actually, he is genuine in this. He's defending himself, etc. But he also thinks that this is going to make Athens stronger. So he answered the accusations, the early accusations about Anthus and Lycon, and then Meletus, who brings about this corrupting the youth and not believing in gods, etc. So at any given point, he is answering one of those questions. So as I said, in response to, I don't remember who it was, but this question of his relationship to death, and taking it to the radical questioning of his relationship to death, and saying, I don't know, and I can't be afraid of anything that I don't know. Okay, so on page 38, as you will see, after the guilty verdict, he proposes how he should be punished, and then at the end he says, okay, you are going to regret this. And that's how it ends. So as you read, just pay attention to those elements, to those pages, and it should be okay. I think it will be pretty easy to understand. And then next comes Crito. There's a little story about the ship. You should figure that out on your own. It's kind of like when the ship goes, there's no execution, blah, blah. So Crito comes and says, so he's not executed for 1 month. So Crito comes and says, I'll like get you out with money or whatever. And then that's an explanation of Plato and his questioning why he should not leave, why he should not escape prison, why he should not avoid the death sentence given by the Greeks. Then again, rather than the actual facts of this, which we don't really know, our issue is like, what is it that Plato trying to get at? What is he trying to convey? What is the principle according to which he is talking? And the principle that is not transactional, it is not good for or useful or in any way beneficial to Socrates, but still acting out of principle that he is trying to articulate, Plato does. So that's Crito. That's only like 10 pages too. So, well, 11 pages. So please read both of those for Thursday. Okay. Any questions? No? So it's like 2 hours, and I mean, we took breaks, etc. So it's like barely 2 hours. So this is a manageable amount of time. I mean, we can't do any less than that. So, but we'll need more time as the time goes by. We'll have more things to talk about, but this is just the beginning. So some of you are here for the first time. Okay, anything else? Please do not forget to sign up for the protocol. I am going to send you the link again to all of you just as soon as we hang up here, and then go ahead and sign up for the protocol. Anything else I'm forgetting? Okay, then have a nice weekend and stay healthy and distant from people. Bye.